Personally, I think they need to expand and add more high-speed rails throughout the country. Currently, there's only two. One in Massachusetts that goes from Boston to Washington, and one in Florida that goes from Orlando to Miami. While there is a few others currently in development, there's nothing really planned to go cross-country, which would honestly be great. Now, don't get me wrong, I love flying and all that, but I think it'd be pretty neat to travel the country by high-speed rail. Well, as long as it's done properly, with all the safety controls in place and the engineers fully and properly trained. Unlike what happened when the Amtrak Cascades line opened up in 2017 in Washington and the train derailed on its inaugural run. So, what happened? I'm Andrew, and this is History's a Disaster. Tonight, we're driving this train right off an overpass and into the 2017 Washington Amtrak derailment. And tonight's episode is brought to you by Billy the Hobo's Freight Train Ice Cream. Have you ever stood by the tracks at midnight, watched a boxcar rattle by and thought, I wonder what that delightful hobo's having for dessert? Well, there's no need to wonder anymore because Billy the Hobo's Freight Train Ice Cream is here. And it's scooped fresh off the rails and right into your bowl. With flavors you won't find at any of those fancy ice cream places. Because Billy doesn't trust fancy. You can try our bestseller, Campfire Bean Ripple. It's vanilla with a smoky finish, and yes, that aftertaste is intentional. Or you can go bold with Tin Can Toffee Crunch, made with real toffee and the crunch of, whatever was left in the can. Feeling adventurous? Grab a scoop of Boxcar Blueberry Hobo Swirl. We won't say how many boxcars it's been in, but it has been in a few. And of course, for the little ones, there's Billy's Bindle Bubblegum. Guaranteed to stick to absolutely everything, just like Billy. Billy the Hobo's Freight Train Ice Cream, it rode the rails, so your taste buds don't have to. Available wherever trains stop unexpectedly. Just make sure not to stand downhill a Billy. In 1971, Amtrak opened up a new passenger rail corridor called the Amtrak Cascades, which was a 467-mile route from Vancouver, British Columbia, down through Seattle, Washington, and into Eugene. Parts of this route used rail lines that had been around for decades. One of them being the Point Defiance line. The Point Defiance line follows the coastline of the Puget Sound between Tacoma and DuPont. The original Point Defiance line was built as part of the Prairie Lines in 1874. Later in 1914, the Point Defiance Bypass was opened up and offered a faster and flatter coastal route around Puget Sound. It skipped the inland routes and it's more difficult to traverse inclines. The Point Defiance line ran both passenger and freight services, which kind of put the line at odds with itself. The passenger line needed a higher amount of scheduling, meaning more trains to meet passenger needs, while the needs of the freight line called for a higher gauge of rail so they could move bigger and bigger cargo. Boeing, having such a large presence in the area and being such a major company and employer, most likely was the biggest one pushing for this with the need to move large aircraft parts around. One of their main 737 factories just happened to be south of Seattle. So, guess who won out? Yep, Boeing, obviously. Two tunnels on the line, which had previously had two tracks, running through them were switched to a single track so they could run larger freight through them. Plus, this area was prone to mudslides, which would often delay the trains. Not exactly an ideal situation for passenger trains that needed to keep a tight schedule. So, in 1992, the Washington State Department of Transportation sought out a new alternative. They began looking for a new Amtrak route. They decided that the American Lake Branch line to the south and the Old Prairie line to the north would make a great bypass for the Point Defiance line, which would bypass the more coastal line with its mudslides and tunnels. So the Department of Transportation published its plans for the Amtrak Cascades service in 2006. It set out all the work required to get the ball going on what would be a massive project. This project would include new track signals and a new bridge and a tight curve straightened over the I-5 near the Nisqually River. The bridge and curve would have cost $230 million alone. And well, since the whole project budget was a little over $180 million, they decided to cut that part out. Who needs a new bridge and less dangerous curve anyways? After all, we can just put in a permanent speed reduction. Max speed on the line was 80 miles per hour and reduced to 30 coming into the curve near the river. No reason to suspect anything could possibly go wrong with that. We'll just give some advance warning to the driver with a couple yellow and black boards placed 2 miles from the speed restriction. That'll surely do the trick. Construction began in 2010 and was mostly done by 2017. Everything except for the Positive Train Control System, which is a GPS and computer-based system that tracks the train's location in real time, tracks and enforces speed limits, and can automatically trigger emergency braking systems in the event the crew missed something like a safety warning or an unknown route hazard. So, it's obviously just some dumb redundant system that's, not really that important. Especially since Amtrak wanted to get their new Cascade service running on the new route as soon as possible. They just had to train its engineers and conductors on the route. Training that mostly included locomotives everyone was familiar with, and a new locomotive called the Charger that was just released by Simmons in 2016. And since the Charger was the latest and greatest locomotive out there, it'd be the main one running the Cascades line, which meant the engineers and conductors had to not only learn the new route, but they had to learn how to operate a whole new locomotive. This involved a lot of classroom time, as well as being shown the operating compartment and familiarization with the display screens and controls. However, none of this classroom time involved any operational time, and observation rides were only occasionally conducted on the Charger. Training for the new route included a number of observation rides, then making 2 northbound and 1 southbound trip while driving the train under supervision of a road foreman. And yeah, fuck that is not a lot of time. Training on any new system needs a lot more hands-on time than that. You can talk any subject to death in the classroom, but that never fully prepares you for doing whatever it is in the real world. During risk assessing the route, the tight curve near the Nisqually River was highlighted as a key point of interest in the line's characteristics. Engineers during their training are meant to learn braking points for stations and speed restrictions. And this new route was no different. Some would use the mile point signs to help identify their locations. A written exam on the physical characteristics of the territory, which included a question about the curve at mile point 19, near the curve, was included in the training. However, it didn't question potential landmarks that could be used to keep situational awareness during a trip. Signs are easy to miss. Knowing possible landmarks to know at the least your rough location, always a good idea. But Amtrak didn't think that was important, and the little bit of training done to learn a whole new route and new equipment was completely adequate. Probably because I never thought much about it before, but thought it was kind of funny having to learn a new route on a train. You're only going in one of two directions. Not exactly like you can get lost or anything. Then I realized it's more than just getting from point A to point B. It's learning the curves and the inclines, where you need to slow down, and where you can go just a little bit faster if you needed to. But anyways, the morning of December 18th, 2017 marks the first passenger service over the new line. The engineer isn't alone in the cab for this run. He is accompanied today by a qualifying conductor who is there to learn the new route. The train consists of the new Charger locomotive, 12 carriages, and a rear locomotive. The engineer had worked for Amtrak since May 17, 2004, originally as a conductor for several years before eventually becoming a certified engineer in August of 2013, working mainly out of Portland. He was experienced and, by all reports, a safe and thoughtful engineer. Train 501 left the Holgate Street station at 6 a.m. and made its short journey to the first stop of the morning at King Street Station. The train was running 10 minutes late, but that really wasn't too much of a concern. The train continued on to Tacoma Dome Station, in doing so, entering the Point Defiance Bypass route. The engineer and qualifying conductor spoke infrequently about the route characteristics and general work bullshit. Due to the time of day and year, it was still dark outside as train 501 passed the points for the DuPont yard. The engineer called out his location. At 7:32, the train went past the advanced speed restriction sign at milepost 17, roughly 2 miles before the curve. The engineer intended to apply the brakes at the sign indicating control point 188, roughly 1 mile before the curve and near a signal box. As the train approached the controlling signal, the headlights washed out the sign, and the engineer missed his braking point. At 7:33, the sign for mile point 19 went past, just a half mile from the curve, and still no attempt at braking was made. Suddenly, an overspeed alarm started to sound. The engineer, unfamiliar with the Charger locomotive, didn't react to the warning. He saw the signal at mile point 19 and assumed they were at CP 188, but it was too late. Aboard were 5 Amtrak employees, a technician from the train manufacturer Talgo, and 77 passengers. At 7:33, the concrete structural walls came into view on both sides of the track, leading to the 30-mile-per-hour restriction. However, the train at this point was going 83 miles per hour. Realizing the mistake, the engineer was recorded on the cab recorder saying, "We're dead." Seconds later, at 78 miles per hour, train 501 hit the curve going over double the speed limit. And still, the engineer didn't make any emergency braking. At 7:34, the lead Charger locomotive and 7 rail cars behind it derailed. The locomotive and rail cars slammed down the embankment beyond the curve, blocking the southbound lanes of the I-5 and leaking 350 gallons of fuel down on the roadway. The only part of the train that remained on the track was the rear locomotive. 8 vehicles were damaged by the train crashing down on top of them, injuring 8 of the 10 people using the I-5. Many of the passengers were able to escape the wrecked train, but some were severely injured. Fortunately, only 3 passengers on the train were killed in the accident. And I know, that sounds horrible to say. Every death is a tragedy. However, in a crash of this magnitude, only losing 3 lives is a fairly good outcome. Especially since there would be some fuckery going around later about how the rail cars were substandard and unsafe. Something the manufacturer Talgo would vehemently deny. And I absolutely agree with Talgo on this. Going back even 50 years, a train derailment that ended with the train plunging off the side of an embankment onto a highway would have led to a much higher casualty rate. Plus, there's the actual cause of death of the 3 victims. 2 of them were killed when they were ejected from the train. As in almost all vehicular accidents, being ejected is one of the worst possible outcomes for a passenger. In motor vehicle accidents, ejections count for nearly 30% of all fatalities. Ejections also have an 83% fatality rate, meaning if you get thrown from your car, there's an 83% chance you're not going to survive that. And I know that's motor vehicles and we're talking about a train, but I would assume a train ejection going to be a little bit more lethal than a motor vehicle. But I digress. The 3rd passenger had been killed when they were struck by a wheel assembly that had broken loose from the train and struck them during the crash. Wrong place, wrong time. Just pure bad luck. Anyways, fortunately, the engineer and qualifying conductor were among the survivors. And I say fortunately because they would be a great asset during the following investigation. At 7:36, the first 911 calls came in, and within 4 minutes, the first emergency responders in the form of DuPont police arrived to assist. Local first responders were quick to arrive on scene to shut the I-5 down and see to the wounded. The most severely injured were sent to multiple hospitals in the region. All other rail services were diverted along the old route, and all services along the Point Defiance Bypass were canceled until the line was fully protected by positive train control, which would take another 2 years. On December 20th, southbound lanes of the I-5 were reopened after some of the wreckage was removed. In total, the destruction and cleanup would cost in excess of $40 million, which would involve completely writing off Train 501 and scrapping it. With the deaths and the damage done, the NTSB quickly launched an investigation. And of course, who would be the star of the investigation? The engineer driving the train, of course. Nothing like first-hand knowledge of exactly what happened to help out the investigation. He was interviewed and found that he was not distracted during the drive. However, he was clearly not familiar enough with the route or the locomotive. He had passed all the assessments, which, along with his previously good driving record, would point the finger squarely at the training being the problem. Plus, there's the whole not having the entire positive train control system online thing. In the NTSB's final report, they summarized the root cause of the crash. The National Transport Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the Amtrak 501 derailment was Central Puget Sound Regional Transit Authority's failure to provide an effective mitigation for the hazardous curve without positive train control in place, which allowed the Amtrak engineer to enter the 30-mile-per-hour curve at too high of a speed, due to his inadequate training on the territory and inadequate training on the newer equipment. Contributing to the accident was the Washington State Department of Transportation's decision to start revenue service without being assured that safety certification and verification had been completed to the level determined in the preliminary hazard assessment. In other words, they placed all the blame squarely on the Transit Authority and the Department of Transportation, which is right the fuck where it belongs. Which is great. Far too many times, I've seen things like this where they try to throw the engineer or pilot or whoever under the bus and blame everything on them and find the government or corporate entity blameless or near enough to it. My personal feelings, the unnamed engineer, couldn't find his name anyways. It's probably out there, but admittedly, it didn't look too hard for it. Despite the lack of braking attempts, he is blameless, or at the very least, mostly blameless. He was thrown on a new route with new equipment with the barest possible amount of training or time to at least somewhat familiarize himself with the route. That's a corporate failure, not a personal one. I'd put that lack of route knowledge at the top of the list as far as what's more important. Even with having the barest knowledge of how to operate an unfamiliar locomotive, knowing the route and where you need to slow down or speed up or whatever, without having to rely on watching for signs is so much more important. Think about it. If you drive the same way to work every day, you don't have to look for signs. You know the road. You know where you need to slow down or where any possible hazards are or where the cops like to sit running radar. That knowledge stays with you whether you're driving a car you've had for 10 years or some brand new car packed with all the fancy bells and whistles. Granted, those bells and whistles might throw you off a bit when you have some strange alarm you never heard before going off in your face, which might fuck you up if you don't know where you're going. But you still know where you're going. After the accident, which closed the bypass to Amtrak service, the Department of Transportation announced that it would not resume service until the full implementation of positive train control. Fucking hooray, they should have done that the first time. Service was then scheduled to restart in early 2019, The positive train control system was finally fully installed by the end of 2018 and activated on the Point Defiance Bypass in March of 2019. After the NTSB presented its final report on the accident, the Department of Transportation issued their own statement that they would need time to analyze the report before resuming service on the line. The restoration of Amtrak service on the Point Defiance Bypass was then pushed back to 2020, after agreements with local officials and the arrival of new Talgo rail cars. Passenger services on the bypass would finally resume on November of 2021, following delays due to COVID-19. And that was the 2017 Washington Amtrak derailment. Thanks for listening, and if you liked the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on your app of choice, and you can reach out to the show at historiesofdisaster@gmail.com with questions, comments, or suggestions, as well as following the show on social media like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, whatever, and share the episode. Your friends will love it. If you're going to train your little penguin friends, don't half-ass it. Penguins are exceptionally active, especially in the water, so keep that in mind when you're secretly training a private penguin army to take over the world. So chase that dream. Live for today, because tomorrow is never guaranteed. Thanks and goodbye.